Hey, y'all, welcome back. Last class, we covered the parts of the brain and their functions. And I mentioned there's an important part of the brain called the corpus callosum, which separates or connects the two separate hemispheres of the left and right sides of the brain. So we're going to talk about this idea of hemispheric lateralization and what the two separate sides of the brain are responsible for. And then we're going to talk about split brain people, in which the corpus callosum, that connector piece, is severed or damaged. And now there's not that communication between the two hemispheres of the brain. They're kind of working separately without that instantaneous communication. So we're going to talk about what that might look like. So let's get on to it. So, if you want to watch this video, this is a story of a little girl who is living without one half of her brain. So I showed the picture of just looking top bottom that there's two hemispheres of the brain. If you just cut the brain in half down the middle, this girl is living with a whole half of our brain taken away, and you'll see in the video that she's actually living a relatively normal life. And that's because of something called neuroplasticity, which is the idea that the brain is plastic, meaning adaptable and malleable. So the brain is able to form new neurons and connections. And if there were a significant injury, because our brain is so plastic and adaptable, different parts of the brain can take on the functions of the parts that were damaged or removed. So neuroplasticity is what allows this little girl who has half a brain missing to live a relatively normal life. And if you watch this video, you see something interesting happen though with this girl is, I can't remember now which one it is, if it's left or right hemisphere, but let's say it's her left hemisphere, the left side of her brain that was removed and taken out surgically. For the immediate time after that surgery, she was paralyzed completely on the right side of her body. She couldn't move her right arm, couldn't move her right legs. And we see that this shows kind of the lateralization of the brain and something actually kind of counterintuitive, that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And this is called being contralateral. So we'll talk about this more in depth, but we see a lot of interesting things from this kind of case study of her. So, like I said, we're talking about this idea of hemispheric lateralization and the role that the right side and the left side of the brain plays in our daily functioning. And I've asked this before, if we've heard this idea that like right brain people are more creative and that left brain people are more like analytical and mathematical. And I'm here to debunk that and say, no, this is wrong. There are some functions that are a little bit more processed by the right side or the left side, but the idea that people are like more dominant in one side or the other, or that leads to like differences in like your behavior and just personality and stuff, is completely false. And that's because for 99.9% of the population, we have that corpus callosum that connects the right and left brain. So there's instantaneous communication. So even if one side processes this type of information and one side processes other type of information, it doesn't matter for us because there's instantaneous communication between that. So it wouldn't result in like significant differences. Like we don't even notice that there's one side or the other side that is more responsible for things. But this idea that I did say that the right side might process certain things while the left side might process more of other things, this is the idea of hemispheric lateralization. So the idea that the right and left hemispheres of the brain each have their own distinct functions. But again, in the typical average person, this doesn't matter much because we have the corpus callosum doing that instantaneous communication. So we're not really aware of that. But in the case of split brain patients in which their corpus callosum has been like surgically cut, typically because of epileptic seizures that are really, really severe, that they did that as a treatment back in the day. In the case of these rare people that they have case studies on, these split brain patients, we're going to see that they do become aware that one side is responsible for certain things and one side is responsible for another thing. So let's get on to it. If I were to ask you to draw both these shapes at the same time with your left and right hand, the average person would really struggle. And that's because of our corpus callosum. We don't have like two separate brains. right? We have like right controlling left, left controlling right. Like everything's kind of instantaneously communicated. So we don't really have separate control of our body to do that. Again, because of the corpus callosum, we don't have there are separate hemispheres, but they're kind of instantly communicating. So we don't have that separate control to really like do two different things at once. It's really hard. So again, moral of the story from this is that people are not naturally more left brain or right brain, but for all people, each hemisphere has its own specialized task to perform. And each hemisphere, like I said, controls the opposite side of the body. So again, this is a picture of our corpus callosum and our two hemispheres. So now let's get on to it. So the left hemisphere is in charge of processing more information that has to do with speech and language. And like I said, it's contralateral, so the left side controls the right side movement of our body. Now let's get to the right hemisphere. Right hemisphere is more processing of like visual spatial information, so looking at images, and a little bit part to do with emotions too. But the main thing we need to know is that it's more looking at visual information. And again, controls the opposite side of the body. So right hemisphere is in charge of moving your left side of the body. So you can see why maybe there's this like people who take that assumption of like, oh, well, the right's more about visual things, so that makes you more creative. But again, that's wrong because people aren't more dominant in one or the other. It's, very equal influence by both because they're processed instantaneously. So again, usually there's no like reason for us to think about or be aware that the left is doing speech and language and the right is doing visual spatial things, or that the right's controlling the left side of the body and left's controlling the right side of the body, until you are the case of this person who has a split brain and had their corpus callosum, the communicator, severed. So remember this forever because they might ask you questions about this, right? If they're asking like, oh, you had brain damage in the left side of the brain, what's going to happen? You can say, oh, well, the answer is probably one that is showing the right side of the body now is paralyzed or not moving correctly. So we're going to see something really interesting happens when people have the split brain surgery and now do not have this communication between these two hemispheres. So let's be aware of these functions. Again, left is speech and language, right is visual information. So now, even when you see something, think about your eyes. Everything is contralateral in our brain. So if you are, something in front of you is getting picked up in your like left visual field, it's going in and being processed in the right side of your brain. If something is in your right visual field, it's getting processed in the left side of the brain because everything's opposite. So that's kind of funky. Now, we also need to be aware of, again, left processes speech and language, right processes visual. So this is how they do experiments with these split brain people. So we have here, this dot represents everything to the left is in your left visual field, everything to the right is in your right visual field. We see here that this man is saying ring. He can speak the word ring. And why this happens is because he sees the word ring and it gets processed in the left visual field. And that's the part, the left hemisphere is the part that does speech and language. So he can speak the word ring that he sees. But what happens? He's holding a key in his left hand, but he cannot say that because that's not in his speech and language capabilities. It's getting processed in his visuospatial. So he can see, right? We see the arrow. He can see the key and is like processing that visual information, and that's getting processed in the right hemisphere. But he is saying the word ring, even though he's holding a key, because that's what he is processing in the speech and language part of his brain. So it's really, really trippy, right? Right? Ring is processed. It's contralateral. It's processed where speech is processed so he can say it. Key, which he's holding, is processed in the right hemisphere, which is in control of visual. So he can visualize it, but he can't get his words out for that. Um, so again, most people live pretty normal lives, even if they're split brain, but there's weird situations like this where it's like they're two separate people and like there's kind of not this communication. It's really interesting. So now these are the important researchers, and we should know their names and what they did, because these are the two guys. Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry are the two guys who did all this important, groundbreaking research with split brain patients. So this video here you can watch on your own time, but there's a guy, Split Brain Joe, and they're the ones who did all these different kind of demos with these guys saying, okay, hey, tell us what you're holding in your left hand. And again, they're going to say ring, and they're going to see this because, again, they're split brain. They can't communicate properly. So it's really, really interesting to see some of the experiments they're doing and like learning what these different hemispheres do. And again, this is a great example of case study research that they're using this unique case of like brain damage to find out more information about what these parts of the brain or these two hemispheres do. So here's a sample multiple choice question on this. An image projected to the left visual field of a split brain person will be processed where? So remember, tell yourself it's contralateral. So if it's projected to the left visual field, then that means it's going to be processed in the opposite part of the brain, which is the right one. This is a little too specific, right? That's just like part of the eye. So where it's actually processed is in the visual cortex, in your occipital lobe. So it'd be right visual cortex. So again, I would recommend you guys go and watch this video here that explains it well and this video here. But you'll see, even same thing, they ask you to like draw like what you see. So he would again have difficulties in drawing that. Like he could say ring, but he couldn't draw that. He would be saying ring, but then he would be drawing a key because the key is what is being visually processed. So if you were to ask this guy, like, hey, draw what it is you're seeing, or tell us what you see, and he'll say ring, even though he's holding a key. And then they say, draw what you see. And you'll see that he draws the key despite saying ring because that is his visual information, right? He's drawing a visual picture of it. Pretty wild stuff. So that's all I have for you today. Have a nice day, everybody.